This is the brand new R1 dive chronograph from Vaer, a retro-inspired, American-assembled chrono that's well built and just about ready for anything. That's just about the gist of it. And good news if you like smaller watches, because Vaer's got you covered, as the one we're looking at today is 38mm. And if you like larger watches, Vaer also has you covered, because there's also going to be a 42mm version. And if you don't know anything about Vaer, well, one of the great things about them is that they offer a lot of options. Sizes, straps, movements, even where some of the watches are assembled. The LA-based brand is one of the big success stories for microbrands over the last few years, and giving people what they want is part of that success. But let's get back to the R1. Along with that 38mm width, this one does come with a lug-to-lug of 46, and a total thickness of 13.4. which includes a closed case back and a double dome sapphire with AR. And like many modern chronographs these days, this one is powered with a Seiko Mecha Quartz movement, the VK63 to be exact. It's that hybrid style movement that many have come to appreciate, as it gives you the convenience of quartz with the snappy response of a mechanical for the chronograph part. Lug width is 20, it has a screw down crown, and weighs in at a comfortable but lightweight 130 grams on its bracelet, give or take a link or two, which all leads to a very comfortable experience on the wrist. And I think this is one of the watch's biggest strengths. It's well balanced and comfortable, and a lot of that is thanks to the great taper of the bracelet. Easily a watch you can wear all day and just forget it's there. Yet still one with a nice amount of presence. Before we get much further, I do have a couple of quick disclaimers. Now, the first of which is that the prototype we're looking at today is just that, a prototype. So all your standard prototype warnings apply. But as far as I know, they're not going to change much with production. And second, the promotional tag is up since Vaer mentioned they'd send me a production unit later on. Now, if you're familiar with Vaer, you may be thinking that there's already an R1 chronograph. And you're right. That was the very first version, and that's still going to be available. And that original one is more of a 70s retro racing style chronograph, inspired right about when the brands like Omega and Tag started introducing more colorful designs into their watches. And evidently that watch has proven very successful for the brand, so they're now introducing two new versions. This one, which is more of a dive style chronograph, and another that's more of a field, both of which have been redesigned with Vaer's existing dive and chrono language thrown into them, yet they still maintain the colorful nature of the subdials from the first R1. Now, part of that big change is to the case design here. Where the original had a blocky 70s cushion case, this one is more like Vaer's divers. And this is a case design I absolutely love, one that's a little Aquaterra-like, with a smooth brushed midline and large polished chamfers, helping to highlight those sexy curves, all topped off with twisted lugs, giving the entire thing a slimmer and sleeker profile. And if you're not looking for a chronograph, go check out their divers with this case. Now the finishing here is fantastic for the price, and that's actually been one of Vaer's biggest strengths over the years. It's what impressed me when I first looked at them back in 2019. That and their commitment to making sure all of their watches are ready for just about anything. Part of what's great and the beauty of that area of Southern California is that you can go skiing to surfing all in a single day. Which is why, even though this is a quartz chrono, Vaer still made sure it has a screwed down crown and 100 meters of water resistance. Although, it is worth noting here that the pushers aren't. And this is one area that might lose the purists out there, is visually, they look like they could be secured, or that little knurled part near the case can unscrew up and secure the pusher. It was kind of a common thing back then, and still with some chronographs. And like I said, this is something that's going to lose a lot of the watch purists out there. It looks good, but a lot of them have the whole don't do it unless you're going to do it right kind of philosophy. So personally, I'm going to knock the watch a little bit for that, but if I'm being completely honest, on the watches I've had that you could secure the pushers, I typically don't. It's actually kind of a pain, so most of the time I just leave them unsecured, so I can't knock it too much. And then there's the bezel here. Now, first off, it's an aluminum insert with a good clicky action. And as you'd expect from a diver, it's got 120 click and is unidirectional. It's also just big enough and has just enough knurling to be easy to get a hold of and use, but not so big as to distract from anything. However, the one unusual bit here is that it's a 12-hour bezel instead of a 60-minute timer. which overall I think works better with the chronograph, as with the chronograph you already have one other element to time things. And the 12-hour bezel here gives you additional functionality in keeping track of a second time zone. My only gripe is that if they were going to go this route, I wish it would have been a bidirectional bezel and not unidirectional. Although, one thing that I do love with this bezel is how it ties into the design, and especially on a smaller watch, as it not only helps to frame in an already busy dial, but with the Arabics perfectly lined up with the indices, it almost seems to be an extension of that dial, giving the entire watch a larger presence. But let's move on to the dial itself. And as far as I know, there's going to be two different versions available. You're going to have a black version and this cream colored one, which has this off-white, flat eggshell kind of coloring to it. And other than that, as you can see, there's a lot going on here, but it is a chronograph. That's to be expected. Over there on the outer edge, there's a very detailed chapter ring. Then you have the applied brushed indices throughout, as well as the very thin brushed hands. You can't forget the bit of text spread all throughout this thing, and of course the colorful subdials. And since this is one that's using the standard VK63 movement, the subdials here are what you'd expect. But I think the design makes them stand out a little bit. Starting down at the 6, there's a running seconds in silver with a red hand. Then, over at the 9, there's a minute elapsed in pale blue. And lastly, over at the 3, there's a standard 24-hour subdial. Except here, they've divided it into blue and orange, indicating night and day. It's a small thing, but a nice addition. And notice, there's no date here, but the movement itself still has a ghost date for those that care. Now, that's the design at a glance, but let's get more into the specifics about what I think works and doesn't work with the design. And if I was going to critique this, there are two things. Well, maybe three, just considering how crowded this thing is. But like I said, it's a chronograph. But the first thing I'd complain about is the 24-hour subdial. And this is something more and more people are getting vocal about. Now, I like that they've added the color to differentiate between night and day. But still, many people are going to consider this to be a bit useless. As how often are you looking at a watch and not knowing if it's AM or PM? And that's something I agree with. For the most part, it's pretty pointless and takes up a lot of space. Space which is vital on a chronograph. However, at the same time, I think it is important to realize why it's there. It's not so much tradition or that they really wanted it, as much as it's just part of the movement. And if you're going to use standard Seiko movements, you don't really have a choice. You could ignore it, like, say, Brew does. But then that would also leave you with an awkwardly asymmetrical dial, like Brew has. Now, if Seiko ever happens to come out with a version that doesn't have this, I'd absolutely love to see one. And I'd also love to see just a bicompact version, or one with just two subdials. And the second thing I'd complain about here, and maybe this is the more important thing, is just a lack of contrast on this version, which granted is always hard to do on a lighter colored dial. But still, here the brushed hands, the thin indices, and the yellow chronosecond hand don't immediately pop out at you like they might with other colors. Perhaps polished hands might look better against the flat dial, or black hands. But those are my real main two negatives. And granted, they are ones that are going to be standard with this type of watch and this type of dial, so you could probably just refer to them more as nitpicks. And beyond that, there's also some great design choices here as well. Like, for instance, the complete lack of a tachometer, or tachymeter, however you want to say it. Which again, might annoy the purists out there because it's more traditional to have one. But it's also a chaotic element that takes up a lot of valuable real estate. And seriously, in this day and age, how often does anyone actually use one? And I think that's a great decision which leads to a cleaner dial. Yes, this is already a bit of a busy dial, but just imagine if it had one of those as well. And however busy it is, I gotta admit that I love the symmetry here. And a lot of that may be due to the 12-hour black bezel and the lack of a date, which creates this circular stepping down effect of the main dial from all the various elements, from the bezel to the chapter ring to the indices. And all of this just seems to bring a bit of order to the natural chaos of a chronograph. And I gotta say, there's something about this cream version on a bracelet I really like. When it first showed up, it was sitting on a black tropic rubber strap. And honestly, at the time, I was pretty lukewarm to it. But the second I put this bracelet on, I just stood back and thought it looked really sharp. Maybe it's because the bracelet helps to accentuate the twisted lugs, and all that brings the black bezel more into focus. Now, for me, I love a panda, and part of me would prefer it if they kept this more monochrome. But variety can be good, and overall, it's a sharp looking watch with some colorful, playful elements. And I can appreciate the boldness taking the path less traveled, which pretty much is the 70s in a nutshell. Now, let's talk Lume, because Lume is another area Vaer did right. And it's impressive to see them do this on a quartz chronograph, and impressive just for how thin the Lume area is on the hands and the indices, as this thing has some serious staying power, easily outpacing a Seiko diver and making this one of the better chronos I've seen for Lume. As for the strap and bracelet options, well, they're all good. Vaer has some great Horween leather, the Tropic straps have a great soft flexible feel, and the bracelet itself is good. And I love that everything here is quick release, making them great choices for everyone, not just watch enthusiasts who happen to have 50,000 spring bar tools lying around. For the bracelet, it's got solid links secured with screws, solid end links with quick release, and a mostly milled clasp. Clasp is milled, but the upper is pressed. Fairly standard stuff. Now, the design itself is potentially a little bit boring. It's just a brushed oyster style. But for a tool watch, that's basically what you'd want. So overall, good bracelet, but there are a couple things missing that would make it a great bracelet. And that's kind of the trick here. A couple years ago when Vaer came out with this bracelet, I would have said it's great. But these days, more and more micro brands in this price range are coming out with bracelets that have both female end links and a toolless quick adjust on the clasp. Now, these might not be things that you would expect at this price point, but they are things people want. As for price and value, well, right now I'm not entirely sure. They actually didn't get back to me on that. So I'm going to go on the assumption that it's the same as the first R1, which starts at $399 and then goes up depending on your strap options. And the thing is, when you look around, there is a lot of competition at that price, and many chronographs lower than that. But I think when you're comparing these to what else is out there, there are two things to keep in mind. The first of which is that this watch is American assembled, which means the parts were imported in and they were all put together, as well as the final QC here in the USA. And I know from previous comments, some people care about this, some people don't. But the point is that does add to the cost. The other, and possibly the more important thing to remember, is that this one is a complete package. Yes, I do have a few nitpicks, when don't I? But overall, there's great finishing, a tougher build quality, great lume, good strap options, all wrapped up in a good looking purpose-built tool watch. And that is really the bottom line, so to speak. Vaer's success is built on offering well-made original watches that are ready for whatever life has in store at a reasonable price, as well as options, lots of options. Now, as usual, let me know what you think about the watch down below, or if you can think of another watch that does it better for less. I'd love to know it. And as always, if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, especially subscribe. It does help the channel. I'm Shane, this is Relative Time, and I'll see you next time.